Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Today I will be discussing the subject of analogical reasoning or qiyas as one of the recognized sources of law in judgment in Islamic legal thought. The Arabic word qiyas literally has two meanings. One of which is to compare one thing with another, or also to measure something against something else. The technical meaning or the definition of qiyas that I will be looking at shortly is also not far from its literal meaning. Analogy or qiyas is a recognized source, although the ulama of jurisprudence have raised the question whether it should be referred to as a source or masdar in the full sense, or as a dalil or evidence, because qiyas does not have in its independent existence as such. It's merely designed to extend the law of the text of the Quran or Sunnah to a similar situation or case. But because of this, the centrality of the Quran in the text, since qiyas has been the principal instrument of extending the laws of the Quran and Hadith, it has acquired a degree of prominence in Islamic legal thought that is somewhat untypical of other legal traditions. Although qiyas has been developed by the mazahib later and specially attributed to the Hanafi school of thought, the origins of qiyas are traceable even to incidents that occurred during the life of the Prophet and also during the period of the companions. We read in the relevant literature that a woman from the tribe of Khasamiya came to the Prophet on one occasion and asked the Prophet a question that my father died without performing the Hajj. Would it be of any benefit if I performed it on his behalf? And the Prophet says, a debt owed to Allah it takes even greater priority than a debt owed to someone else, to a fellow human. Here a kind of analogy, a very simple analogy is drawn between two varieties of debt. On another occasion, Umar ibn al-Khattab asked the Prophet a question during the month of Ramadan, whether kissing vitiated the fasting. And the question was asked in return whether gargling vitiated the fast. Gargle one makes during wudu. And Omar knew the answer to this question. He said no. So the answer to your question is the same, the Prophet replied. Here again, an analogy is drawn between two activities, kissing and gargle. There is an element of doubt that is introduced into the integrity of fasting by these two. In the same, there is a similarity. And the Zahiris in the Shia, among the leading schools of jurisprudence, do not accept qiyas as a source of Sharia. but all the other schools tend to do, although with some kind of their own reservations. One variety of qiyas that is generally accepted to be a stronger qiyas than others is when the effective cause, illah or rationale of analogy is drawn from the clear text. For example, we have a hadith, a clear hadith, that every intoxicant is like khamr, like wine, and all wine is prohibited. Kullu musakkirin khamrun wa kullu khamrin haram. Now, if you draw an analogy between wine drinking and a variety of narcotics, LSD or cocaine, the effective cause or the illah of this prohibition is given in the hadith because it is intoxicant. Then the same rationale is extended to the case of the drugs, and a parallel is drawn between the two. The ruling of the text, which is prohibition, is extended also to the case of the drug. So this brings me to the definition of qiyas. The definition is analogy is extension. Qiyas consists of an extension of the ruling of Sharia or the Hukum from an original case to a new case because of the commonality of an effective cause between the two. And the original case is called asl, the new case is called far'a, the rationale is called illah, and the ruling that is extended is the hukum. And I have already given an example of this. There are many examples in the text. For example, we have a hadith, la yarisul qatil. The murderer does not inherit. If someone kills another person, his relative, he cannot inherit from him. Now the text mentions miras, but this ruling, this prohibition is by analogy extended to the case of a bequest. If someone has made a bequest in favor of a relative and this surviving relative has killed, then he cannot inherit. Here inheritance and bequest are two similar cases. The hukum is prohibition and the illah is the killing of the relative or severing the ties of kinship. There are other examples that are found in quite a detailed chapter in my book, Principles of Islamic Jurisprudence. Analogy has played a prominent role in the laws of commerce, contract, and transactions, mu'amalat. A great deal of the rules of contracts are actually drawn from analogy of one sort or another to the contract of sale. In order to construct a valid analogy, a valid qiyas, certain requirements have to be fulfilled. These requirements, there has to be first the four pillars, the essential requirement of analogy, as I have mentioned. The original case, the new case, and the illah and the hukum, the rationale and the ruling. These are the four pillars. But each of the four pillars must fulfill certain requirements. The requirements or the conditions each of the four pillars of qiyas must fulfill. First, the requirements of the original case or asl. The main question asked here is, what is the asl of qiyas? What is the original case here? The original case is either a text of the Quran or a text of the Sunnah. The original case is found in these sources, and these are accepted universally as valid asl for qiyas, for analogy. And also ijma is recognized as a valid asl for qiyas. But then the question arises whether one analogy can be a valid asl for another analogy, and here differences of opinion arise. We discuss here two scenarios. One is if the illah of the second qiyas that we are about to construct is the same as the illah of the first qiyas, then it would become a futile exercise and not valid. There are, for example, 6 items, usurable items, ribawi. Wheat and barley, gold and silver, salt and dates. In a particular hadith, these are declared as amwal ribawi, usurable items. These must be measure for measure, transaction over them, hand to hand. There should be equivalence. And that is the requirement. Now, we now want to find out whether rice falls under the ruling of wheat. We draw an analogy between them, and the answer would be both are edible, storable. This is the illah. And say that, draw the analogy that yes, rice falls under the ruling of wheat for purposes of riba. Now we are asking another question, whether potatoes would also fall under the same ruling. Now if we are constructing this analogy and illah is the same, edibility, storability, then why don't we draw this analogy between potato and wheat directly instead of drawing this from the qiyas based on qiyas? That is not purposeful. This is building speculation upon speculation. Although qiyas is a recognized source, as I would proceed, there are various levels of doubt expressed about the reliability of qiyas as a source of law in judgment. There is this famous example of Imam al-Ghazali who gives, if you walk on a beach and pick up a pebble, you walk along and you want to find another pebble similar to it. You hold this, the second one, throw the first one away. Then you want to find another one similar to the second. You hold this in your hand and you throw the first. And the third and the fourth and the fifth in the series, if you compare this to the first in the series, you might find that the two resemble very little. This is the kind of doubt, although the application of this to human situation may be a little questionable, but that is the basic position with regard to one analogy being founded on another. Yet the ulama of the Maliki school in contemporary scholars, Abu Zahra, Al-Zarqa, and many have actually validated qiyas based on another qiyas, and the rulings of and judgments of the courts of Sharia and other courts actually apply this all the times when there is an original ruling and then later you have a similar case and the rationale is transferred to another similar case, a series of analogies, because these are not replicas of one case. There is always some difference, and this becomes a source of enrichment for the Sharia. Case law develops through the application of this method, and it would not be advisable to close the door to the idea of one analogy being founded on another. And the second requirements of is that the law of the text. What conditions must the hukum fulfill in order to become a valid basis for analogy? Firstly, the hukum must be in existence in the positive sense. In the sources, there must be a hukum. And for that reason, presumption is not counted as a hukum. Ibaha, this or that is permissible. We can say that even without the positive text. But this cannot be the basis or the hukum for purposes of qiyas. The second, that the hukum must be a practical hukum, practical ruling, just like the fiqh is ahkam shar'iyya amaliya, practical rulings of the law. We do not apply qiyas to theology and to ibadat. It must be, ibadat is also practical, but to theology and dogma, because they do not relate to practice. And the third condition for a hukum is that it must not be the subject of a great deal of disagreement. And fourthly, that it must be rational. The ruling, the hukum must be rational, that we can understand it. Like prohibition of gambling and prohibition of riba, we can understand those, the reason for those. But when you ask the question why in the salat, in the ritual prayer, we have one bowing ruku and two prostrations sajda, why not two of both? We don't understand the illah or the reason for this, because this is a matter of ibadat. In ibadat, the hukum is not always detectable to reason. But generally speaking, the ahkam of Sharia are understandable. They are all rational, except for ibadat and certain other areas. When we talk of qiyas, we mainly think of muamalat more than ibadat. Then the third pillar of analogy is the new case, the fara. What conditions must this fulfill? Firstly, we must ensure that this new case is not governed by a clear text, a ruling of Quran or Sunnah or Ijma. Should there be a clear text about this case, qiyas would be superfluous. And secondly, that the effective cause of the original case is equally applicable to the new case. Should there be a discrepancy in the application of illah to these two, then qiyas is invalid. This is called qiyas ma'al fariq, qiyas with the discrepancy. For example, in the intoxicant, wine is intoxicant, and we extend that to the case of a narcotic drug which is also intoxicant. But if this new drug only causes some kind of headache or some lapse of memory, then the illah is not the same and we cannot apply qiyas. Third condition of the new case is that is the application of the illah to the new case does not alter the law of the text, because analogy should be in the service of the law of the text, not to overrule it. And there is, for example, in the Quran, the ruling about slanderous accusation or qazaf. This is 80 lashes of the whip. But there is a supplementary punishment also, and that is وَلَا تَقْبِلُوا لَهُمْ شَهَادَةً أَبَدًا. Never again accept the testimony of those who have committed slanderous accusation. Now, this is accepted, that the text tells us don't accept the testimony, but the Shafi'is argue. They say, well, qazaf is one of the had offenses, and once you have applied the punishment to the person, is not very different to the other had offenses, like theft, like adultery. For those people, once they are punished, their testimony is acceptable. So why, what's so special about qazaf? And therefore, once they are punished, their testimony is acceptable. But then, this goes against the law of the text. The text clearly tells us. And therefore, the application of the illah to the new case should not be such that it would go against the law of the text. And finally, the conditions that the effective cause of our illah of qiyas must fulfill. And this is the most important pillar of analogy. The effective cause, the rationale, ratio, legis, ratio, decidandi. They are similar concepts, whether in common law or Islamic jurisprudence. In Islamic jurisprudence also different expressions exist, like sabab also means cause, manat al-hukum, and the cause of the ruling, or amaratul hukum, the sign of the ruling. These are expressions. There are some differences, like sabab is and illah are different in the sense that illah is rational. Sabab is used in the context of ibadat, illah in the context of muamalat. In definition of illah is given as an attribute of the original case, that is constant, evident, and also bears a proper relationship with the law of the text. I will explain these requirements. The illah must be constant. In other words, it is not changeable in different places and at different times and circumstances. You need a stable basis for the law. And if it is changeable in case to case, that would not be acceptable. An example of this given is the law of preemption or shufa. The illah or the effective cause of the law of preemption entitled the neighbor, the owner of the neighboring property, to buy if the other neighbor sells his house as a matter of priority. He has the right of preemption. What is the illah of that? The effective cause for that is to protect the neighbor against the possible harm. Now, this is a constant factor. If you are an owner of this neighboring property and the case arises, you are entitled. Now, when you pass a traffic light, to give a contemporary example, a traffic light, the red light appears, and this is, you must stop. The illah of this prohibition is the appearance of the red light. Now, this is a constant factor. It doesn't change. It applies constantly in all cases. But what is the hikmah or rationale? Hikmah is a similar concept. And the difference between hikmah and illah is that hikmah is not constant. Now, if you say that the hikmah or the wisdom of this prohibition is to save life, it is possible someone crosses the red light and is still and doesn't cause any problem. But that would be something that is not constant. We cannot proceed to have a law which applies differently to different cases. Therefore, although there is some kind of, a problem with this, but that is accepted that the illah must be constant. The second requirement of illah is must be evident. Because it is the basis of lawmaking, it must be evident. It cannot be a hidden factor. For example, the illah or the effective cause of a contract is the meeting of the two minds. But that is a hidden factor. What is the illah of a contract? We say it is ijab in qabul, offer in acceptance expressed in words that we can prove, and that is the illah of contract that we accept. Paternity, and the cause, the illah of paternity is accepted to be marital cohabitation, not the fact of conception. Conception is something it's not evident to us, but we say it's marital cohabitation. The illah is proving paternity. That was the second requirement, that it must be evident. And then also that the illah, effective cause, must bear a proper or munasib relationship with the law of the text, in that it secures the purpose of the lawgiver properly. And for example, the prohibition of liquor drinking is intoxication, not because it is acidic or because it is different color. This color and its taste is immaterial. It is intoxication because it bears a proper relationship with the ruling of the text. Similarly, if someone kills another, he cannot inherit from him, not because he is a black man, the killer, or he is an elderly man or a woman or this, but because he or she has killed. That is the proper relationship with the law of the text. And next is that the illah must also be transferable, muta'addiya. It can be transferred from an original case to a new case. If it is a fact, a constant, a fact that is confined to the original case, then it cannot be a proper illah. For example, a concession is given to the traveler during the month of Ramadan. He may not observe the fast because he is a traveler, traveling. Traveling itself is the illah of this concession. But traveling is a factual situation, it's not transferable. But if you say it is hardship, then hardship is an abstract. And then you can transfer this to similar other varieties of hardship. That is the difference between the illah that is transferable from one case to another and the one that cannot be transferred. The purpose of analogy is to facilitate this kind of transfer from one case to another. If you confine yourself to the original case, that would not be a proper basis for illah. The illah, in other words, should be an abstract, an idea, rather than a state of fact. And finally, the illah, the application of the illah to the new case should not be such that it would alter the law of the text. There was an actual case in history, and the ruler, the Umayyad ruler of Andalus, happened to have marital relations during the fasting month of Ramadan with his wife. And he wanted to pay the expiation, the kafara for that. He asked the Mufti of Andalus what would be his kafara, because there are three: releasing a slave, and in failing that, fasting 2 months, 2 months of fasting, and finally feeding 60 poor persons. And the Mufti thought that, well, if I tell this man to feed this 60 people or to release a slave, it's easy for him. So he said, your kafara is to observe 2 months of fasting. Here the illah, it's not proper, because the order is like that. First release of slave, second this, third this. It should not be applied in such a way that would interfere with the order that is given in the text. There is a differential, another example in the laws of inheritance between male and female. It is a law of the text, the double entitlement to a double share of the male and female, the same degree of relationship, a brother and a sister. Now, if you draw a certain rationale that they work both, equally hard, or they're this and that, therefore should be given equal share in inheritance, that would go against the law of the text. There are other ways. If there are real situations that we should equalize this, I've discussed that in my other works on istihsan, there is making a bequest and so on. But you do not make a law like that. Okay, that was the discussion of the 4 pillars of analogy and requirements that they must fulfill in order to qualify as a proper rukun or pillar of qiyas. There is another discussion that we move on to, is the identification of effective cause, masalik al-illa. It's a detailed discussion in jurisprudence, and I would not wouldn't want to go into a lot of technical details, but they are available in the chapter. Basically, how do we ascertain the illah? As I have said, the proper place to start is the nas, the text, the textual ruling of the Quran, and then the Sunnah. And there are many, many instances where the text gives its own illah. For example, وَلَكُمْ فِي الْقِصَاصِ حَيَاتٌ. In the law of retaliation, for you there is life. In other words, the law of retaliation, the illah of this is protection of life, of innocent life. And that is the law of the illah. In the earlier I cited the hadith about intoxication. Clearly the illah is given. إنما الاستئذان لأجل البصر. If you go to a private home, you must ask for permission to enter. The illah for that is the viewing. If viewing is in order to facilitate viewing, there is the kind of, the text explains its rationale. Viewing is allowed through asking for permission. La yaqdil qadi. The judge does not adjudicate if he is in a state of anger. What is the illah of this ruling? Being in a state of anger. And there are many, many instances where the effective cause is given in the text. Also, if not found in the text, maybe sometimes ijma in consensus might have determined it. We accept that. Failing that, and in most cases, when there is no clear indication, we resort to ijtihad. To ijtihad, that is the intellectual exertion of a qualified jurist and mujtahid, to identify the proper effective cause or illah of a particular ruling. Sometimes you find that there can be different illah identified for the same. Then the job of the mujtahid is to identify which one. Like in the case of, this prohibition of crossing the red light. We can say different rationales or illah. One is to protect life on the road. The other, to facilitate orderly flow of the traffic. The other is maybe there are different types, varieties of rationale. Sometimes they exist for the same law. Then you extract the correct one. There is a 3-step procedure in jurisprudence that I have explained here, which I would not describe in detail. And this is extraction of the illah. You extract the maybe 3, 4, 5 possible illah. Then this is takhrij al-manat. The second step is tanqih al-manat. That is isolation of the proper effective cause. And the third step is ascertainment. You test and you find out that this is now the proper illah. There are examples I have given, but I will move on to another discussion, that is the types of qiyas. There are varieties of qiyas, and I would discuss here mainly the 3 varieties of analogical reasoning or qiyas. And these are straightforward varieties. There is little complication, and some of them are actually disputed whether they are types of qiyas as such. The first, the classification of qiyas into 3 types, the one I'm discussing, is from the viewpoint of the strength of or weakness of the illah in qiyas. It is in 3 types. First, qiyas al-awla, the analogy of the superior. This is a type of analogy where the illah of qiyas, the application of the illah is more evident in the new case than it is in the original case. It is stronger the application of illah in the new case than it is in the original case. You might say LSD or cocaine is more intoxicant even than the liquor. This may be qiyas al-awla. Another example in the text is respecting the parents, one's parents. In Surah 17, verse 23, do not say a word of contempt to your parents. Do not utter even an uff. فَلَا تَقُلْ لَهُمَا أُفٍّ وَلَا تَنْهَرْهُمَا وَقُلْ لَهُمَا قَوْلًا كَرِيمًا. Always be dignified, treat them with respect to your parents. Now, to draw an analogy of the superior, what if you physically abuse your parents? If you are not allowed to say an oath, obviously you are not allowed to physically abuse them. This will be qiyas al-awla, the application of the illah, respect for even stronger in the new case than it is in the original case. The second is analogy of equals, qiyas al-musawi. The two are more or less equal. The new case and the old case, and the application of the effective cause to the two of them. For example, we have in the Quran, Surah 4, verse 2, which prohibits devouring the property of the orphans. وَلَا تَأْكُلُوا أَمْوَالَ الْيَتَامَى. Do not devour their property. Devouring means that you actually enrich yourself in an unlawful way. But then there may be other ways of destroying the property of the orphans, even if you do not enrich yourself. That would be equally the case. By analogy of the equal, any form of destruction of the property of the orphans would fall under the ruling of this prohibition, and that they would be more or less equal. And then we have qiyas al-adna, and this is the analogy of the inferior, meaning that the effective cause or the illah of analogy is less evident in the new case than it is in the original case. This is called, actually the Hanafi say that the first variety, an analogy of superior, is not really qiyas, is not analogy. You apply the text straight to this and that, it falls under the ruling of the text direct. But qiyas al-adna, the analogy of the inferior, is a proper variety of analogy. This is sometimes also called qiyas khafi, qiyas jalli, or obvious qiyas, or a subtle analogy, subtle qiyas, in which case the illah is less evident in its application to the new case than it is to the original case. For example, in the earlier illustration we gave of extending the ruling of usury or riba from wheat to rice, and then maybe to apples. Wheat and rice are more or less equal, analogy of equals. But if you are about to extend the same prohibition and say that apples is also a usurable item, all this is edible and this is storable, and the illah may apply, but it does not apply as well or as equally as it applies to those first two items. So here you have the analogy of the inferior. Often you find that in analogy there is a certain element of indirectness. If it is directly applicable, the ruling of the hukum or the ruling of the text to the new case, there is no need for qiyas. There should be some scope, some room for intellectual exertion, ijtihad, to make it a proper qiyas. This would be the variety of qiyas that qualifies these requirements. I continue my discussion with the proof of analogy, whether there is any proof in the Quran or Sunnah to authorize qiyas as a valid source of law. And the short answer to this question, that there is no clear text or hadith to say so. But the ulama have quoted a large number of verses from the Quran and some hadiths to say that there is authority in the textual sources for qiyas. And I have quoted these on several verses, 5 or 6 on page 287, 288, and Surah 4, Ayah 59, أَطِيعُوا اللَّهَ وَأَطِيعُوا الرَّسُولَ وَأُولِي الْأَمْرِ مِنْكُمْ فَإِن تَنَازَعْتُمْ فِي شَيْءٍ فَرُدُّوهُ إِلَى اللَّهِ. If you dispute over a matter, then refer it to God and to His Messenger. And the ulama have concluded the best way to refer a case to the Quran and Hadith is through analogy. This is the most perhaps evident way of complying with the message of that text. In another text, 4150, Surah 4, we reveal to you the book with the truth. إِنَّا أَنزَلْنَا إِلَيْكَ الْكِتَابَ بِالْحَقِّ لِتَحْكُمَ بَيْنَ النَّاسِ بِمَا أَرَاكَ اللَّهُ, so that you judge among people on the basis of what Allah has shown you. To judge among people based on the divine command and rule, qiyas is that is the way. فَاعْتَبِرُوا يَا أُولِي الْأَبْصَارِ in Surah 59, verse 2. Consider issues, O people who have eyes to see, or consider you possessors, O you possessors of eyes. And similar other verses, how do you do that? Qiyas is a recognized way of referring to the authority of the text. Then during the time of the companions, the Umar al-Khattab, to Abu Musa al-Ash'ari in his judges, and his advice to his judges is to ascertain the similitudes in similar cases for purposes of analogy. In the Sunnah also there is authority in the hadith of Mu'az ibn Jabal. When the Prophet was sending Mu'az as judge to the Yaman, he asked him 3 questions. How do you judge over a case when it comes to you? The first answer was, I refer it to the Book of God. But if you don't find any ruling there, I will refer it to the Sunnah of the Messenger of God. And failing that, I would exercise my own ijtihad based on my opinion. Now, ijtihad here mentioned when qiyas is the flagship of ijtihad. According to Imam al-Shafi, he wrote in his Risala that almost equating ijtihad with qiyas. He says qiyas is in the two are different expressions for the same meaning. It's not quite accurate, but this will tell you that there was so much emphasis on qiyas as a principal avenue of ijtihad that they literally equated the two. Of course, ijtihad is in many other varieties. I now move on to the argument against qiyas as a source of law. Briefly, I have written on this, but Ibn Hazm, the leading figure of the Zawahiri school, has been outspoken. He does not recognize it basically because of the element of doubt that is detected in the illah, the ascertainment of illah mainly. It says that the illah is either given in the text to us, in which case we accept it, or it is not, in which case we cannot be sure whether this is the true intention of the lawgiver or not. He gives it his argument in 4 points or 3 points. Firstly, the ahkam of Sharia are on 5 varieties. And this is obligatory, prohibited, recommended, permissible, and reprehensible. Now, basically, they fall under 3. Wajib, that is obligatory, prohibited, and permissible. These 2, prohibition and obligation, can only be established by virtue of a clear text. In the absence of a clear text, the matter falls under permissibility, ibah. There is no room for analogy in that case. Second point is that the Quran and Sunnah are self-contained, provides for every eventuality. He quotes ayat, so Surah 6, ayat 38, we have neglected nothing in the book. مَا فَرَّطْنَا فِي الْكِتَابِ مِنْ شَيْءٍ. And then we وَأَنزَلْنَا الْكِتَابَ تِبْيَانًا لِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ. We reveal the book as an explanation to all things in Surah 16, ayat 89. That to bring qiyas in the face of these verses in the Quran is unacceptable. Some ulama have understood this. The kitab here does not refer to the Quran. It is the Lawh al-Mahfuz. That is the first in the preserved tablet. The Quran was revealed in 3 stages. That is the first stage. The kitab is a reference to that. But that is an understanding. Okay, that was the second point. And the third point is that the illah of qiyas, I have said, is either given in the text or it is not given. If it is not given, it is no more than speculation. And we read, إِنَّ الظَّنَّ لَا يُغْنِي مِنَ الْحَقِّ شَيْئًا. Speculation avails nothing against the truth. In another verse, do not take a stand without having knowledge. لا تقف ما ليس لك به علم. But an answer, it has been said that these verses actually apply to matters of aqidah and not to mu'amalat in the same way. In mu'amalat, in practical rulings, we accept zwan as a basis of hukum. To summarize, Ibn Hazm's points are that the nusus of the Quran and Hadith provide for all eventualities. This is not quite accurate. If that were the case, what would be the point of having a science of usul al-fiqh? We will just apply the ruling to every situation. That is an exaggeration. The Jumhur ulama says that we have a limited number of textual rulings. Otherwise, we apply the idea of extending the logic of the text to other cases. And finally, ijtihad in the absence of the text. Then my last discussion is limitations on the application of qiyas. And the Hanafi school seems to be outspoken on this. especially in the case of penalties, the hudud, in the kafarat, the expiations. To penalties in the matter of punishments, crime and punishment, it is the law of the text that applies, not analogy to the text. This is also the position in common law, in other legal tradition, because of the speculative element in analogy. We don't apply it to penalties because it's sensitive. But the Jumhur do not quite agree with that. They say that when we read the text of the Quran on these punishments, they do not draw this exception that this applies, does not apply to penalties and this and that. Since the text is general, open, we apply it in the same sense. The Jumhur would thus extend the punishment of zina to sodomy, the 100 lashes, draw by way of analogy. But the Hanafi say, no, it's not quite the same. The illah is not the same in the two cases. They don't apply. Similarly, the punishment of theft is applied to one who digs graves and steals from the dead. This does not meet the definition of the theft. It must be mal muhraz, that is property that is guarded. The dead person cannot go. But these are the kind of Hanafis would not apply by way of analogy the punishment of slanderous accusation of 80 lashes to the question of insult, of other varieties of insult. Because of that, the hadith quoted here is idra'ul hudud bil shubhat, drop the hudud, the punishments, wherever there is an element of doubt. Even though the Jumhur have said this, but there is a general element of restraint that we should try not to apply analogy to penalties. And I think that I will stop here. The details, almost in every topic I have discussed, fuller details can be seen in the textbook that I have also